Good afternoon, and welcome to our weekly short reflection, whether you're here in church or watching online. Of course, if you're here, please feel free to continue your visit this afternoon. I'm Catherine Waddams, a lay minister here, and I'd like to talk about hot cross buns. Hot cross buns are now in the supermarkets, and of course some correspondence in one national newspaper. According to one letter, they come in on Boxing Day. This does seem rather soon after Christmas, even in a year when Easter is very early and Lent is close. Ash Wednesday is just 5 weeks away. This year's readings will take us particularly quickly into the story of Jesus' death by following Mark's account, the shortest of the Gospels, sometimes described as a passion story with a prologue, because it is so focused on the last week or two of Jesus' life. Of course, Christmas makes no sense without Easter, as the poet Stephen Turner put it in his poem, Christmas and Easter, published in his book, Nice and Nasty. Let me read it to you. Christmas is really for the children, especially for children who like animals, stables, stars, and babies wrapped in swaddling clothes. We've got all of these in our own crib, which is still up. Then there are wise men, kings in fine robes, humble shepherds, and a hint of rich perfume. Easter is not really for the children, unless accompanied by a cream-filled egg. It has whips, blood, nails, a spear, and allegations of body snatching. It involves politics, God and the sins of the world. It is not good for people of a nervous disposition. They would do better to think on rabbits, chickens, and the first snowdrop of spring. Or they'd do better to wait for a rerun of Christmas without asking too many questions about what Jesus did when he grew up, or whether there's any connection. This seems particularly apt this year as we have celebrated Christmas against the backdrop of violence and terror in the Holy Land. The fluffiness of the popular Christmas story has sometimes seemed like escapism from the reality of life. And Happy New Year is tinged with the reality of how many people are facing violence, uncertainty, hunger, homelessness, anxiety across the world, as well as the threats posed to the planet itself. Perhaps the somberness of Jesus' own persecution and death seems to chime more with the reality of today's world than the promise of the stable, even as the leftover mince pies wait to be taken to the food bank. So perhaps it's worth focusing for a moment on the part of Christmas story that we have most recently celebrated, the visit of those wise men, kings in fine robes, as Steve Turner calls them. Of course, the royal connection, the number of them, and even their gender have been added as part of our Christmas story, perhaps for the children. We don't know that they were kings. One translation is distinguished foreigners. Matthew's Gospel tells us that they brought 3 gifts, but we don't know how many people were involved. And we don't know that they were all men. Magi, the word used in the Greek original, could refer to a mixed group of men and women. In a sense, it's the last part of the story that we can include artistically in the Christmas cards and at the crib, before it all starts to go horribly wrong with the massacre of the innocent children in Bethlehem, when Herod was alerted by just those same Magi to the potential threat of a new king in his patch. But what about those gifts from the wise people? Of course, they packed those before they set out on their journey, thinking they were looking for a rather more traditional prince. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh were all traditional gifts for kings. It must have seemed very strange to deliver them in the humble Bethlehem surroundings, so different from the palace which they expected. Our Christmas carols reinforce the Christian tradition where we particularly associate the gold with Jesus' kingship. I wonder whether it helped to finance the flight of this young family into Egypt after the Magi had left. We are only too aware of how much it costs to be a refugee, to ensure safe passage, often with unscrupulous people smugglers. I see the current cost to flee the horrors of Gaza to Egypt is reported to be about $10,000 per person. We associate the frankincense with God, traditionally burned in the temple as a sacrifice. As with the kingship, Jesus didn't exercise his spiritual power in traditional ways or indeed established institutions, but in challenging how the world and its powers worked, including in the temple. Myrrh was one of the spices used to anoint the dead, which we interpret as foretelling Jesus' suffering, that Passion Week link again. But it was also used as an ointment for healing and relief of pain. Indeed, both frankincense and myrrh were and are still used for medicinal purposes, as well as for their religious significance. Frankincense is apparently good for relieving arthritis. All these gifts seem very strange for a small child, and we have interpreted them differently from their original symbolism, transformed by Jesus' own interpretation of what it meant to be king and God and sacrifice. As for our own gifts, another carol, In the Bleak Midwinter, ends with our promise to respond to God's love for us, shown at Christmas, to bring what we can, i.e., ourselves. Not, you notice, the people we hope to be or wish we were, but the person that each of us is. And the Epiphany story shows us that Jesus will accept what we bring and may use it in ways which we could never imagine. Just like those wise people, we may be surprised at the place where our own star leads us to find Jesus, and at how our gifts of ourselves are used. Not necessarily in flashy ways, as in courts of kings or places of great influence, nor even, perhaps, in traditional church institutional settings, but in our everyday life, however we, by bringing our true selves, can contribute to the common good and the kingdom of God, which Jesus showed us to be so countercultural and upside down. So as we journey from Christmas to Good Friday, from mince pies to hot cross buns, we should not forget that Easter resurrection follows, that God can and does use our gifts in very surprising ways, and that hope can come out of the most unpromising situations and unlikely disasters.